Hey solo gamers, thanks for checking out How's It Play Solo. I'm Mac Kern, and today I'm taking a look at Dawn of the Zeds 3rd Edition. Now, the 1st edition of this game was designed as a solitaire-only experience. The 3rd edition adds cooperative play and also a competitive mode, but I'm only going to be going over the basic solo game today. Additionally, there are multiple difficulty levels for this game. There's a basic game, and then there's 5 additional levels of difficulty beyond that, and each level of difficulty adds some new concepts. What I'm going over today is the level 2 game, which is 2 steps above the basic introductory game. Let's check it out. In Dawn of the Zeds, you control the heroes of the town of Farmingdale, and you're trying to prevent a horde of zombies from reaching the town hall. And before I get into the structure of the game, I want to talk a little bit about setup, just to kind of quickly go over all of the things that are on the board. First of all, before you start playing, you have to build an event deck, and this is chosen from cards that correspond with the level of difficulty that you're playing. And there's a couple different lengths of game that you can play, so I have it set up for the solo short game right now. One interesting thing about these events is that they go in order. So the first cards that I draw are going to be part of Act 1, and then later on I'm going to be going to Act 2, and then go through Acts 3 and 4, and see if I can survive till the end. And so it's kind of neat how those event cards are kind of tailored to be played in a rough order. You have cards that will only be played towards the beginning of the game, cards will only be played towards the end of the game. You also have a Fate deck, and this is also composed of cards that correspond with the difficulty level you're playing. I'll talk more about that later. You start with 4 heroes in Town Hall. You get to choose one of those heroes, and the other 3 are randomly selected. The heroes also have a corresponding reference card that gives you the hero's stats and abilities. If you flip it over, you get a backstory for that hero, and you also get a reference to any additional components that are involved in that hero's setup. So Deputy Schmidt, he is accompanied by a corresponding initiative action token during setup, so that reference just gives you some guidance as far as setting up the game. You also start with a heroic civilian unit in Town Hall with your heroes. There's a couple different heroic civilian units. You randomly select one. They also have a reference card that goes with them. You start out with some random Zed units on the board, so they start in the starting space. There's one in each starting space for each of the 4 tracks that lead into Town Hall. You roll dice to determine the number of supplies that you start with, and I got a pretty good roll, and some of the heroes and heroic civilians that I'm using have granted me additional supplies. That supply roll also affects the amount of ammo that you get, and you also set up this action marker. This keeps track of your actions during your turn, and the infection marker. I'll talk about all of this later. You also have some regular civilians in each village space and in the town hall. The village spaces are the ones that have a yellow border around their sign. So this is what a regular civilian looks like, and they start out with this defiant marker on top of them, and that means that they can't move until a zombie unit, until a Zeds unit enters their space. They'll lose that marker. Also in each of the village spots, you have villagers, and they are also defiant. Once a Zed unit controls the space that they occupy, they lose their defiance and they turn into fleeing refugees. And then also, the last thing that I need to mention is that you grab a player action marker to use during your turn. At the beginning of each turn, you draw the top card of the event deck, and this card walks you through the upkeep that you have to perform every turn. Most turns will have these same phases, but there are some special event cards that you just perform a special event and then move on to the next card. But again, most of these will have the same phases, so once you get into the flow, it's pretty easy to keep up with. So the 4R phase, that means Raiders, Rangers, Refugees, and Rescuers. So I mentioned Refugees during setup, and that's when these villagers turn into fleeing refugees. But Raiders, Rangers, and Rescuers are all introduced by either fate or event cards. It'll tell you to put those on the board. During this 4R phase, they move. Sometimes you have a choice, sometimes they move automatically. There's reference cards for all of those that dictate how they move or how they're allowed to move. But the number on here, that corresponds to the refugee units. And so what that number 1 means is that if I have these refugee units on the board, I have to move at least one of them one space closer to Town Hall on the corresponding track. If that number said 0, I wouldn't have to move any. If it said 2, I would have to move 2 if possible. That's what happens during the 4R phase. If one of these refugee units makes it to Town Hall, you have to increase the infection, and I'll talk about what infection does in a second, but because these dudes are carrying the disease, you have to increase the infection if they make it to Town Hall, and then you add this unit to refugee camp, which can increase your end game score. You also, I didn't mention this during setup, but you have this free equip refugees action, which allows you to arm refugees and use them as civilian units later in the game. The second phase is the infection phase, and there's 2 possible outcomes here. If instead of these 2 dice, this little infection tab just said no, I would skip the phase entirely. But when it shows those dice, I roll 2 dice, and then I compare the number I rolled to the current infection rate. So as long as I roll higher than the current infection rate, I'm okay, good to go, I move on to the next phase. But let's say maybe my infection level is at 6, and I only roll a 5. What I do is I have an outbreak. So you have to draw a fate card, and that tells you where this outbreak occurs. So this is occurring in the suburbs. I'm going to draw a random Zeds unit, and I'm going to place it on the village space closest to the town on the corresponding track. So this is going to the suburbs. So I put it on that village space. Because they're civilians, it would trigger hand-to-hand combat, but I haven't gotten that far yet, so I'm going to gloss over that for now. After any fights or anything were resolved, I would resolve the plot twist on the cards. So there's 2 options on these fate cards. Sometimes it says play this card. That's normally a bad thing that happens, so there's an event that I would trigger here. Other times it'll say hold on to this card for later. You can save it and play it at an opportune time to help you. After I've done all that, I decrease the infection rate by the number I rolled. So you remember I said that my infection rate was 6, I only rolled a 5. I decrease the infection rate by 5. There's another interesting thing that can happen. If your infection rate ever reaches the number 13, you have what's called an unchecked outbreak, and the procedure for that works pretty much the same as what I just showed with drawing a fate card and then placing a Zeds unit there. But instead of drawing a regular Zeds unit, you draw a Super Zeds unit, and the Super Zeds are bigger and stronger and have special abilities. So you want to keep your infection rate low in general, because then you have better chances of rolling higher than the infection rate during that phase, but also you really want to keep it from reaching the highest spot on the infection track, because those Super Zeds are a pain to deal with. The third phase of the turn is the Eat phase, and if there's a 0, you just skip the phase. If there's a number 1 or a number 2 on the tab for this phase, you subtract that number from your supplies. Sometimes there will also be a picture of a die on the Eat phase tab. If that happens, you roll a die and compare it to the number of units you have in the hospital. Later in the game, you'll have units that can be sent to the hospital. If you roll higher than the number of units you have there, you can proceed to the next phase. If not, you have to subtract 1 supply. If you're unable to pay the supply, you have to pay a penalty. Basically, for every supply you're short, you have to add 1 wound or 1 hit to a player unit of your choice. The next phase is the Zeds phase, so this is when Zeds move. And I'll also point out that there is, at the beginning of this phase, effect. This doesn't always happen during the Zeds phase. Sometimes it happens during your action. Most of the time it's either during the action phase or the Zeds phase, but it can happen in like the 4R phase as well. But for that, you just follow the instructions that are listed here. These logos here represent the tracks that are being activated. So there are 4 tracks that are leading to Town Hall. And this card says that we have to activate this is the highway track, and then the yellow is the suburbs track. The green is the forest track. So when you activate a track, if that track does not have any Zeds units on it, you draw a random Zeds unit from the bag and place it on the start space of that track. If it does have 1 or more Zeds units on it, then you move each of those units 1 space closer to Town Hall. If a Zeds unit ever reaches Town Hall, you immediately lose the game. If a Zeds unit ever enters a space with a player unit, or sometimes with non-player units, like some of the units that I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the 4R phase, sometimes those will enter combat as well. But if a Zeds unit ever enters a space with a player unit, you initiate hand-to-hand combat. So let's say that I have the deputy over in this space, which is the Farmingdale Suspension Bridge is the name of that space. And let's say that during this phase, I have a Zeds unit that moves into that space. We have hand-to-hand combat. So the first thing that happens is the infection level is increased, because anytime there's contact, more people are infected. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to compare the strength of these 2 units. So the Zeds' strength is 5, and the deputy's strength is 4. So I'm going to look at this chart, and it looks like the Zeds have an advantage. Now, if the Zeds had a strength of 8, they would be twice as strong as my sheriff, so I would look at Zeds times 2. If, for example, the Zeds only had a strength of 2, and remember my deputy has a strength of 4, then I would have a human times 2. So you find that initial column, and then you look for any modifiers. So you'll see that defending units get this terrain shift. Now, the Farmingdale Suspension Bridge is a named space. Any space that has this little sign logo, those are named spaces. So any named space, defending units get a bonus of 1 column. So bonuses that benefit you always move you to the next column over. So we start out with a Zeds advantage because the Zeds are stronger. That terrain bonus makes it so that I get to use the equal column for this combat instead. Now when I look at Deputy Schmidt's abilities, he receives a bonus of 1 column in all hand-to-hand combat also. So those stack. And so what I'm looking at now is human advantage. So I'm going to roll 2 dice, and let's say that I roll a 7. I look in the human advantage column, and it looks like the Zeds take 2 hits, I take 1 hit, and anytime there's combat, there's always a winner and a loser. The loser always has to retreat. So the red on the left means that the Zeds are going to be retreating, so I get to stay in the space that I'm in. So these Zeds take 2 hits. Now you can see that there's 3 little symbols in the lower right-hand corner. So the first hit that's applied is just going to be a hit token applied. The second one is going to be, I can flip that over, and it'll say times 2. The third hit means I have to flip this Zeds unit over. And at this point, it's on its decreased strength side. So it was a strength 5, now it's a strength 4. And if it takes hits later on, again, I would add a hit token, I can flip it to the ×2 side. When it takes another hit, that unit is removed from the board and I return it to the supply of Zeds tokens. Hero units are much more fragile, so after the deputy takes one hit, I have to flip him. And that second hit that he takes actually destroys him. Lots of units, especially the player units, when they die, you make what's called a saving roll. And for a saving roll, you roll one die, and for the player units, what happens with them is if you roll a 1 to a 3, you failed the saving roll, and you just stick them in the cemetery. But if you roll a 4, 5, or 6, they get to go to the hospital. When a unit gets sent to the hospital, you place it in a hospital bed if there's one available. You increase the infection level by 1, and you place an EKG marker on it, which is just to represent that the unit is comatose. Later on, you can perform healing actions that will remove that marker. You can restore hits, and then also healing actions lower the infection level. Another thing I should mention while talking about movement is chaos. And chaos occurs when, after movement, so let's say this Zeds unit ends up at Farmingdale University, which is a named space. Named spaces is any space that has a name to it. So these are named spaces, all of the town spots are named spaces, etc. If after any movement and any possible combat, if the Zeds unit is still occupying that space, you add a chaos marker to that space. And chaos is important for a couple of reasons. One is that there's a finite number of chaos markers. I think it's 10 for this scenario. And if you run out of chaos markers and need to place one, then you lose the game. Another reason why chaos is important is that if one of my hero units is moving into a chaos space, it has to end its movement, and it can't perform its normal actions there. The only thing that you're allowed to do, you can still do hand-to-hand combat, and then at the end of the player's action phase, which I'm about to talk more about, if there's a hero or some other player units are able to remove chaos from the board, it's called restoring order. So when you do that, you get rid of the chaos and you increase the infection level by 1. The final phase of a turn, the action phase, is the most fun part of the game because this is your opportunity to fight back against the onslaught of Zeds. So the number on the tab for this phase represents how many actions you're granted this turn. And then you'll always have at least one action from your player action token as well. So if this card grants me 1, and I have a player action that grants me 1, I have 2 actions that I can spend on any playable character. And there's a bunch of different things that you can do with those actions. One thing I'm able to do with my actions is move my characters. Every character has a movement value, so Captain Piazza has a movement value of 5, which means she can move up to 5 spaces for one action. So I can keep track of my actions granted to me by the card with this little action token. So I'll spend an action to move her 5 spaces. Now if I move one of my units into a space with a Zeds unit, I initiate hand-to-hand combat like I just talked about during the Zeds movement phase. It's important to remember that those terrain bonuses, like the bonus that I got for being in a named space, those only apply to defending units. And if I'm the one that's moving a character to initiate the attack, I'm the attacker rather than the defender, so I don't get that bonus. But I still get any bonuses. Like I showed that Deputy Schmidt has the 1 column bonus in all hand-to-hand combat, so that's whether he's the attacker or defender. But I can move for an action. Another thing I can do is I can shoot gunfire, and that requires 1 action, and you have to spend an ammo to do that. So when I'm doing that, I get to attack someone in an adjacent space. The standard gunfire attack is in an adjacent space. So if I have a Zeds unit over here and I'm using Captain Piazza for gunfire, I roll 2 dice and I have another chart to use for gunfire. So I don't have to worry about the Zeds unit's strength. I just look at her strength, which is 3. And I'm going to find that column, roll 2 dice. If I roll a 7, I get to do 1 hit to the unit that I'm firing at. Also, some characters have like a long-range gunfire ability. Captain Piazza is actually one of those. So she can fire from 3 spaces away. Her strength would be considered 3 when you're looking at the chart for that. If she's 2 spaces away from the target, she can have a strength of 4. So if I had her in the suburbs and she was firing at this Zeds unit, because she's 2 spaces away, rather than looking at the 3, which is her normal strength, she can look at the 4 instead and use that column. Another thing I can do with my actions is forage for supplies and ammo. I'm able to forage in any of the spaces listed on this chart, and the results of my die rolls are different depending on where I'm at. But in general, rolling a 4, 5, or 6 will get you either supplies or ammo. Normally you have to roll a 6 to get ammo unless you are at the mine or the security guard post, which isn't actually on the side of the board that I'm playing on right now. I mentioned earlier being able to heal units that are in the hospital. Comatose units aren't able to do anything, but once you have units that are no longer comatose, they're able to be used for actions again. And again, you can decrease the level of infection when you heal. The restriction for healing is that you can't heal one unit more than once in a turn because healing takes time. You can also build defenses with your actions, and to do that you spend 1 action and you spend 2 supplies, and you get to place a barricade in the location of whichever character you're using for that action. And the barricades just provide a defense bonus of 2 columns. So if in a later turn, after I build this barricade, if this Zeds unit moves into this town, instead of getting the normal 1 column terrain bonus, I get a 2 column bonus for having this barricade. And it's not in addition to, because barricades and the fact that this is a named town, those are both considered to be terrain bonuses, and you only ever apply the best terrain bonus. Finally, lots of characters come with their own additional actions that can be used during the action phase. So Deputy Schmidt has an action called Initiative, and that allows him to spend 1 action for his unit every action phase. And just like with the player markers, you just flip that over to the spent side to note that you've used that action. Once you've finished taking all of your actions, you discard the current event card and you draw the next one to start the next turn. If you're able to make it the whole way through the entire deck of event cards, then you win the game. And there's some scoring guidelines where basically you score points for all of the good things you have left on the board. So hero units you still have left, leftover supplies, refugees in the refugee camp, etc. And then you lose points for the amount of chaos that's on the board. And then your score tells you how well you survived. Before I get too heavy into my opinion of the game, I want to point out that Dawn of the Zeds is pretty far outside the range of the solo games that I typically am interested in. I play a lot of Euro-influenced games where the mechanics kind of stay out of the way and let you kind of do your own thing. And Dawn of the Zeds isn't really like that at all. The narrative is a huge part of the game, and I don't dislike theme, but theme doesn't really draw me in as much as it does for some players. And the thematic elements in this game are very strong. Everything that happens kind of makes sense from a thematic perspective. The game really tells a story as it evolves. You know, at the beginning of the game, you have kind of like a little bit of tension, but then that tension really ratchets up towards the end of the game. And there are some really cool event cards that, you know, bring in the National Guard, or there might be fate cards that allow you to bring another hero into Town Hall, and then that hero will have some abilities that contribute to the things that you're able to do. So there's a lot of really cool thematic things that are going on, and if that's what you're interested in, then this is a really great game that should definitely be on your radar. For my taste, there's a little bit too much upkeep involved, and it's gotten better as I've gotten more familiar with the game, but I find that it's a little tedious to go through, okay, I'm going to move this unit because the card told me to move this unit, and then I'm going to roll to see if I survive this hand-to-hand combat, and I'm going to increase the infection, and oh, if I increase the infection, then there's an outbreak. And I have to do all these things that I'm not making decisions for. And so I have to do so many things before that last part of the turn where I get to do 3 actions or 4 actions. And it just feels kind of underwhelming. And I get that balance, you know. The board state changes and you have to react to it. And I enjoy the decisions that the game presents you with, but I wish I was making more decisions, or I wish that I was even spending more time making decisions. And I think that there are some ways around that, you know. Some people may say, well, play an easier version of the game, play a more basic level that has less upkeep. And while that's a valid option, the amount of decisions that you can make decreases too. You know, I want to be able to use the advanced characters. I want to be able to use the advanced actions. And you know, I think that I might have to look into the co-op game, playing a single player, because you get more actions in the co-op game. You just have to deal with more Zeds units as well. I do want to emphasize too that the decisions you make over the course of the game are very meaningful. A lot of games that emphasize narrative kind of downplay mechanics or kind of give you an illusion of control, and I don't think that that's the case with Dawn of the Zeds. I think that the actions that you perform have a strong effect on the outcome of the game. There's just a lot of upkeep in between every time you get to perform those actions. I definitely haven't given up on Dawn of the Zeds. I find myself drawn to play again and again. And I do feel like the more that I play, the more rewarding it'll be. I just feel like anyone that's interested in the game should know that you do have to put in a bit of effort before you're able to play smoothly. But if you're interested in narrative experiences, if you like mitigating sort of a crisis scenario, this is absolutely a game that you need to look into. So check it out.